Hello and welcome. My name is Garrett Snedeker, and I'm the host for today's webinar and the Deputy Director of the James Wilson Institute. Today, our topic is Congress, Policy, and a Conservative Strategy in a New Administration. We're pleased to be joined by two friends of the James Wilson Institute today. First, Rachel Bovard. Rachel is the Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute. She previously worked as the policy director of both the Senate Steering Committee and the Heritage Foundation. I first got to know Rachel during the meetings that she co-chaired for the Senate Conservative Working Group when she worked for Senator Mike Lee. She's the co-author of the book Conservative, Knowing What to Keep, and her writing has appeared in USA Today, The Federalist, Newsweek, and Real Clear Politics. She's also a fellow at Defense Priorities and a senior advisor to the Internet Accountability Project. Born and raised in Dansville, New York, she received her bachelor's from Grove City College. She also holds a master's from the Graduate School of Political Management at GW. In addition to her public policy pursuits, Rachel is also an accomplished sommelier, a wine educator, and a diploma candidate in the Wine and Spirit Education Trust. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks so much for having me.
Next, Kerry Schilling. Kerry is the executive director of the American Principles Project. Kerry is responsible for developing, coordinating, and implementing APP strategy, messaging, and grassroots activity at the state and federal level. Kerry's worked in communications, development, grassroots, and management positions with Representative Chris Smith, Senator Sam Brownback, and various state and local candidates. He's a frequent guest on cable news, including Fox. Before joining APP, Terry managed his father's successful race for Congress in Illinois. Terry's a graduate of Franciscan University of Steubenville and a proud father of 5. Great to have you with us, Terry.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Garrett. Really appreciate it.
Excellent, excellent. Now I just want to turn it over to our founder and director, Hadley Arkus, who wanted to share a brief word with both of you and with our supporters. So we'll give Hadley a chance here to come on screen. And there he is. Oops, I'm going to make sure he's unmuted. Let's try again. There we go.
Oh, there we go. There we go. No, I just wanted to first commend and thank Garrett for putting the program together, and to thank Rachel and Terry for coming on. We have two quite accomplished young people who've done so much already in their lives. I'm looking at that flag, it's a rather old flag behind Terry, and I wonder, are there 50 stars on that flag?
There are 50.
Okay, I just hope there won't be one more at the end of this Congress. And Rachel, it's just so good to have you. And now that I know your other credentials, I'd like to have your opinion on that Gigondas 2017 I got for a rather reasonable price at Trader Joe's. Okay, but listen, this is a fine topic at a fine time. So I'm going to recede and just jump into times if I have a question or commentary to offer. But again, Garrett, thanks so much for setting this up. And Rachel and Terry, thanks so much for coming on.
Excellent. So I thought we'd begin today's webinar by discussing, by point of historical comparisons, the structural dynamics of the current Congress, which will then allow us to move on to specific substantive policy points with a little better context. So the first comparison is to a period not too long ago, and I wonder if we're perhaps going to get a replay of it during this Congress. It's the 2009 to 2011, so that's the 111th Congress. Democrats then, as they do now, had the trifecta of control in the House, but with an 80-seat margin, in the Senate, but with a 60-40 filibuster-proof majority, and then the presidency after the close of the George W. Bush administration. As a refresher, here's what they accomplished. Primarily Obamacare, but also a $900 billion stimulus, and then Dodd-Frank financial reform. Now, at the time, those accomplishments were significant, but looking back, now a lot of political commentators think that largely that was an insufficient legislative slate of accomplishments given those wide majorities. At present, Democrats again have the trifecta, but much slimmer margins, and yet their ambitions are even greater. a $1.9 trillion stimulus able to be passed largely via budget reconciliation, abolishing the legislative filibuster, hacking the courts, statehood for Puerto Rico and DC. Now, Rachel, Terry, what do you make of comparisons to 2009, 2011? Are they overwrought, or are we likely to see the same kind of ambitions? So yeah, Terry, go ahead.
I think it's a very similar situation to what we experienced in 2009 to 2010. Just in the level of aggression from the Democrats and their willingness to push things to the next level. They've in 2009 and 2010, we have to remember, even though their policy packages like Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, those seem very small in comparison to today, they were still very aggressive for their time. No one had ever done an overhaul of our healthcare system, let alone our financial system in the United States in that way. And what we've seen over the last 10 years is the Democrats have become more angsty and anxious and aggressive in their nature to address what they view as severe ills. And we have to also remember that, with what they did to President Trump, they made him appear to be an extremely radical president who was outside the mainstream, and now they're coming for retribution simply because President Trump spent the first 4 years in office primarily undoing a lot of the damage that the Obama administration had done. So I think that the biggest question here is whether or not the Democrats are willing to get rid of or convince the members of the Senate and their party to go against the filibuster. If they're able to do that, then I think that it's going to make 2009 to 2010 look like a very minor bit of policy changes. But if they can keep the filibuster and we can keep our sanity, I think it'll be much closer to the 2001 to 2002 Congress.
Mm-hmm. Rachel, do you agree?
So I think, procedurally it's somewhat similar. Obviously, you have a much tighter margin in the House. I think the slimmest margin, in like 200 years. And that could change very easily, regardless of whether Democrats win elections. The redistricting going on could redistrict them out of the majority very quickly because that margin is so tight. But I think the context in which a lot of these debates are taking place in the country is much different than what it was. We have a very hostile sort of takeover, a fusion, if you will, between the Democrat Party, big business, big corporations that are willing to, deplatform views. And you're starting to see Democrats weaponize that power against Republicans in a way that I think will actually change our politics if we let it. You're seeing Michelle Obama, Joe Manchin, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez look to the big tech companies to literally remove their political opponents from those platforms. And so there's much more of a hostility, I think, taking place in our politics than there was even 10 or 15 years ago. And that sort of fusion of business and government, I think, is going to change the stakes, I think, for how Republicans approach some of these deals. And it should, because it's not just, them, they're representing a lot of people that are going through this as well.
So both of you don't think that this is more like the second Obama term, where we had actual divided government and a House that could put the brakes on any either executive initiative or Senate-led initiative when the Senate was controlled by Democrats?
I agree with that, Garrett. And the one thing that I forgot to mention was just how much the mainstream media has changed since 2009 and 2010. Back in 2009 and 2010, you still had opposing viewpoints on CNN and MSNBC and the ABCs and the major broadcast networks. They've shut that out, and they're now full on what I would classify, and people might disagree, but I believe that they're full on propaganda mills who will not only attack the opposition as being racist and homophobic and transphobic for opposing a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill, but they won't even have our viewpoints on. They'll skew them. And so to that point, I think it's much closer to 2009 and 2010 because the Democrats and the progressives who are pushing these policy changes have the bulk of the mainstream media behind them. And you're even seeing the progressives in the media and also social media. I include them because it's how we get our news for the majority of Americans. They're shutting down the opposition. We're now openly talking about, on CNN, they're debating whether or not OAN, One America News, should be able to broadcast their news. And, we saw what happened with Parler. They're shutting down alternative sources for information. I think it's very dangerous. And I think that's the biggest thing that is different from 2009 and 2010, as well as the second Obama term.
Yeah, to put a finer point on it, I think, back in 09 and 10, when they were passing Obamacare, the biggest Democrat critique at that time was that you wanted to kill grandma if you opposed Obamacare. The critique now, if you oppose them, is that you are a domestic terrorist and you're racist and you're homophobic and you are pick your poison. So it is gone. The rhetoric, I think, has gone on full blast 180 from where we used to be.
And so, Rachel, you think the rhetoric doesn't stop, but it is accompanied by a lot of the hallmarks of the second Obama term, pen and phone strategy from an executive, and the like?
Yeah, I do think we're going to see a lot of executive action out of the Biden administration. I mean, this is just how we do things now, right? This is what we unfortunately expect, because we've had such a supine legislature for so long that they've effectively made themselves irrelevant to a policy debate. Now, and I think we can talk about this, Republicans, even in a 50-50 Senate, have the ability to sort of assert themselves. Whether or not they will, I think, is an open question. But yeah, I expect most of the Biden hammer to be swung from the executive order perch.
Yeah, that actually is, I think, a good segue to discussing a little bit about how analogous we are to that that unique historical period at the beginning of George W. Bush's presidency, where we did have a neat 50-50 split and then a power sharing agreement between the Senate minority and the Senate majority leader. Rachel, can you tell us a little bit more about what we saw in 2001 and then what we're beginning to see out of Schumer and McConnell right now?
Yeah, so that was the Lott-Daschle sort of power sharing agreement, which everyone's sort of remembering now and looking back and saying, what elements are we going to replicate? And, to some extent, you're starting to see that be implemented, right? So at the beginning of each Congress, the committee ratios and the committee budgets are always negotiated. It doesn't matter kind of what the split is. It always is negotiated. It seems like it's going to be a pretty even equal split, which is representative of of the precedent that already exists. But what we haven't seen yet is the details of an operational agreement, because that's the second part that has to be negotiated. And this is where I think, how Mitch McConnell comports himself in regard to whatever agreement they strike in this regard is going to tell us a lot about, how Senate Republicans, if they're going to aggress at all on any kind of policy priorities. Because so what I mean by operational agreement is specific to committees, right? Especially with nominations. This is going to be the early fights that Democrats and Republicans have in the Senate, or what is going to happen to Joe Biden's nominees. Now, an operational agreement will detail if these nominees can be reported out with a minority vote in the committee, because if you have equal majorities on the committee, it's very possible, right, that these nominees don't get a majority vote, and thus they don't go to the floor. If they set terms that say, well, we're just going to agree because we're in a 50-50 split that a minority vote, even if they don't get a majority of votes out of committee, they can still go to the floor. If we agree to that, Republicans have sacrificed a ton of leverage right out of the bat. Because think about the fact that, these Democrats in the Senate have spent the last year planning to blow up the institution, right? They have not hidden the fact that they want to blow up the legislative filibuster, pack the Supreme Court, add DC and Puerto Rico as 2 states, thus 4 new Democrat senators, and fundamentally change the institution in a way that, entrenches Democrat majority power basically forever. Mitch McConnell has the ability to say, look, if I'm going to make it easier for you to get your nominees out of committee, you must also agree as sort of an operational function of the Senate that you will not nuke the legislative filibuster. You will not seek to, add DC and Puerto Rico states. He has the ability to set some of those terms such that should the Democrats do that, then the Republican consensus on nominees goes away. So there's a lot of leverage that we have in this 50-50 split. The question always is, how aggressive are we going to be in using it?
So this is really a matter of battlefield tactics, not battlefield ethics then, right?
It's always a matter of tactics in the Senate, right? Everyone has leverage. Every senator has leverage. The Republican Party always forgets this. We feign helplessness. We say, oh, we can't do anything. We pretend, we throw up our hands. But in reality, because of the way the Senate is set up, where each member has almost equal authority, individual members have tremendous amounts of power to affect change. And that doesn't change in a 50-50 Senate. It almost gives you more leverage.
So how much leverage, Rachel, does McConnell have in making Kamala Harris as vice president? How much leverage does he have in making her life miserable by always having her be present to break ties? Or does Schumer have more tools at his disposal that will require Harris's presence at some tie-breaking votes, but maybe not for every single vote?
Well, it's less a matter of McConnell, I think, than it is a matter of every other Republican senator, because for most questions, right, on the legislative side, you're going to have to convince 10 Republicans to come around to break a filibuster, right, to get to that 60 vote threshold. But on nominees, it's effectively a majority vote. And so it's less a question of where McConnell is than it's a question of where McConnell and Mitt Romney are, right? Or, McConnell and Pat Toomey or Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski. Those are going to be the senators, and there may be others, that if they cross lines, if they cross party lines on some of these nominees, then they won't require Kamala Harris to break the tie, right? So I think it's a matter of how each individual senator decides to comport itself. McConnell can whip them, right? McConnell has the ability as the leader to try and enforce some cohesion around sort of tactical voting and tactical goals. But at the end of the day, each senator has to speak for themselves.
Mm-hmm. And Terry, do you see McConnell being able to successfully keep the Republican caucus together on the most contentious nominations fights, or do you see maybe him keeping the caucus together more on the legislative fights?
Yeah, I think so. APP has written several op-eds praising McConnell's strategies over the past few years when it comes to judges. We think that he's, he decided very early on in his tenure as majority leader that to keep a united caucus within the Republican Party, they were going to focus on judges, nothing else. And so if there's one thing I think that he's good at, it's figuring out where the caucus is and leading them there. I think it's a matter of the political will of a lot of the other people, like Mitt Romney. I think we've heard some rumors that, everyone's focused on Manchin. Will Manchin go against the filibuster, or, will he get rid of the filibuster? And I actually think there's a bigger risk in Lisa Murkowski, possibly if she views that she's going to have a difficult enough primary, there is a risk that she could join the Democrats. And before you think, oh, well, she'd never do that because she would be able to win Alaska, don't forget that she did run, after losing the primary in 2010, she did run as a write-in candidate and win there. Alaska is a very interesting state in that regard. So I think that, there's a lot of risks that we have right now, and McConnell is going to have to weigh those out for what's worth it and what's not. I hope he errs on the more aggressive front of fighting these nominees. Just today it was announced that Biden has chosen Rachel Levine to be the Assistant Secretary of Health at HHS. For those in the audience that don't know, Rachel Levine is a transgender woman, Secretary of Health and Human Services in Pennsylvania. Who is, it's not just the transgender part that's controversial. Rachel took her parents out of a nursing home at the height of COVID, and while thousands of COVID patients died at these nursing homes, including many senior citizens. So there's a lot of controversy surrounding them. It doesn't seem like Biden is going to shirk away from this fight, and it's whether or not Mitch McConnell and the Republicans have the political willpower to stand up to a nominee like that and stop it. And we'll just have to see what they come up with.
Mm-hmm. So Rachel and Terry, who do you view as the most important senators on the Democrat side and the Republican side in being able to shift momentum on nominees and then also legislation?
So I just want to disabuse everyone of the notion that Joe Manchin is somehow a profile in courage who's going to stand against his own party on key questions, procedurally or politically. He's not. He's just not that person. I've observed him for a long time now. He will do what his party wants at the end of the day. Kristen Sinema perhaps is someone I think that could go, one way or the other. I don't know that she's been tested in this way on really controversial issues to be the swing vote, the deciding vote. That's a very difficult position for many members to be in, and you have to sort of have an internal makeup that I think gives you the disposition to do that. I don't know that she does, but maybe. On the Republican side, we have our our collection of members that like to tip their hat, I suppose, to Democrat priorities. And that, is led by Mitt Romney. Susan Collins, I think, can go either way. Lisa Murkowski. Pat Toomey has been very surprisingly vocal on a lot of these issues. Remember, he's retiring.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of has nothing to lose at this point. So I don't know where he'll find himself, but he would be one to watch, I think. Again, it's going to take 10 Republicans to vote with Democrats on legislative issues. Assuming the filibuster remains in place, you need 60 votes to proceed to basically anything. But I am curious to see if there's any remaining institutionalists on the Democrat side, because it's not just the legislative filibuster that I think we should watch. It's the budget reconciliation process, which I think will be a more forthcoming test. That's how I expect the Democrats to try to pass Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion stimulus bill via the budget reconciliation process. There may be some distortions to that process as well. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious to see what the debate is around that. Because fundamentally, if that changes, right, if we change the reconciliation process, that opens up a whole new can of worms, because that, again, is by majority vote.
Right. Some of the Democrats I had on my list, Senator Hassan from New Hampshire, Senator Cortez Masto, and Senator Kelly from Arizona, just because all three of them are up in the near term, and those are swing states. But then I'm not sure. I haven't been following their votes as closely. If they actually would show inklings of being institutionalists, or if they're going to be relying on their party's base. What do you guys think of those three?
I'm kind of pessimistic on those three, especially the ones in the swing states like Kelly and Hassan, simply because this isn't your typical these aren't going to be your typical policy debates, right? Like, this is the end of democracy, or this is allowing domestic terrorists to live freely in this society, or killing Black lives. These are going to be highly contentious debates, and I think that you're going to need, this is a little bit unconventional, but you're going to need institutionalists from the solid blue states. And one of those institutionalists that I think is very interesting to me is Dianne Feinstein from California. I could see her as someone that is more pragmatic. Yeah, she likes the power. She's been elected forever. But I could actually see her being pretty sober-minded when it comes to issues like climate. I'm sure many of your audience members have seen the video of her being confronted by the climate activists in her Senate office. The climate children, right. And she was, to her credit, she was very sober and was telling them, like, well, we're never going to get this done in 10 years. I've been in the Senate for 30 years. And so what you're saying is true. We're all going to be dying. That was a great exchange. So I think that there are other institutionalists like her that maybe more of our hope is going to rely on, because she's already voiced some hesitancy at ending the legislative filibuster. I think that the most sobering thing for me anyway is that I think that these Democrats know just that there's no going back. Once the legislative filibuster is gone, it's all out war. They better make sure that they get every single bit of legislation that they ever wanted passed. And maybe they go that route because the opportunity is right. In the Republican caucus, one of the most interesting members to me is Tom Cotton. Tom Cotton is someone that, he's been on both sides of the Trump train, right? He was actively supporting him throughout the election, ran tens of thousands, probably over $100,000 worth of TV ads for him to help him get reelected. But then when it came time to vote for impeachment, he's on the other side of that vocally. And so he's one of the most interesting members, because I think that he could help bring members like Mitt Romney or James Langford, people that we're starting to see problems with currently. He could bring them more to the table to stand strong on some of these other issues. Obviously, I think Josh Hawley has still some influence in the Senate. He's a very crucial vote, and they're going to need him on lots of different things. But yeah, I'd say Hawley and Tom Cotton are very interesting members of the caucus for us.
Let's shift to some policy areas and how a positive Republican agenda can contrast with the Democrats' agenda. One of the reasons why we were grateful to bring both of you together is to give you a chance to articulate how both of you envision the Conservative Party regaining its standing and relevance. So I wanted to give a few minutes to each of you. Maybe Rachel, you can start just by laying out the vision that you at CPI and the Internet Accountability Project, just the general work you do informing how a positive agenda can be laid out.
Yeah, I think this is the perfect time to do it, right? When a party sort of finds itself in the wilderness, this is the time to build. And this is the time to draw sort of distinctions between yourself and the other party. You know, and at CPI, we work a lot with the conservative members of Congress on policy development and strategy. And then obviously at the Internet Accountability Project, you know, I'm very focused on shifting the paradigm that I think has existed for a long time in the base, or at least in the institutional Republican Party, which is that, you know, the government is the only threat to liberty. I think we're seeing very much, at least expressed dramatically in the last couple of weeks, that actually corporate collusion with government can actually be a threat to liberty. So, you know, I think a strong conservative, you know, agenda for the next couple of years has to reflect the fact that, you know, we have a new coalition now. I think Trump changed the coalition substantially, but I also think that it was there for a long time, and Trump spoke to that vision. And, you know, it reflected one that, you know, cares about debts and deficits, but not to the exclusion of a lot of other really important issues. You know, we're going to see this fight come up soon with immigration, for instance. And President Trump spoke about immigration in a way that made it an economic issue as much as it was sort of a question about nationhood and citizenship. That resonated with a whole lot of people who saw their jobs wiped out by, you know, corporate or deference to corporations and cheap foreign labor. Are we going to have those debates again? Are we going to stand up for those, you know, talking points that brought Hispanics into the Republican Party, that brought working class voters into the Republican Party? I think this is also true of a robust family policy that I'm sure Terry can talk about. But, you know, again, do we, as the party that says we care about family formation and development, are we prepared to prioritize that as a policy? That, I think, is an open question for Republicans generally, but also conservatives. You know, and then finally, how do we, you know, fight sort of this entrenchment of corporate power from companies who hate us? You know, these are companies who literally do not want us to exist. How does the party that has had a reflexive alliance with big business start to rethink that? You're already seeing, you know, corporations pull money from, you know, conservatives and Republicans because of different policy choices they've made. Perhaps that offers us a very good time to reassess, you know, this automatic deference that we have to, you know, corporate power at the expense of the middle class in a lot of ways, but in the expense of a lot of other policy priorities that, in fact, maybe we should be focusing on. So it's always about emphasis, right? It's not about excluding views. It's about what we emphasize, and do we have the ability to coalesce around an agenda that we can enact the minute Republicans take power again.
Yeah, Terry, talk a little bit about how APP's work overlaps with those initiatives, and then, you know, maybe some other areas too.
Yeah. So, you know, APP, we brand ourselves as the NRA for families. And what we mean by that is our mission is to organize families in politics, campaigns, elections, and legislative fights to fight against the enemies of the American way of life. And so we look at every issue like that. And right now with the Democrats in Congress, there's a lot more defense that we're going to be playing. We're going to be attacking their policies that they're trying to go on offense with. And when I look at what the Democrats are doing, there are three major threats. And, you know, politics is central to APP, right? And it's actually central to conservatism because politics and elections is the one thing that is still controlled by the people. It's the one cultural institution that's still controlled by just everyday people who show up to vote in the polls and elect their members of Congress and legislatures. And that is now under attack. And it's under attack in two main ways. I don't know if many people are familiar with this, but the Democrats are going to be pushing a new Voting Rights Act, and basically nationalizing the Georgia election system. All the way down from not just the mandatory mail-in balloting, but down to the verification of signatures, which make it impossible to verify signatures of registered voters who are casting ballots by mail. So if we can't preserve our elections and the integrity of those, and make sure that two things. One, you need to make sure that they actually are free and fair, but they also need to appear free and fair. Because if you don't do both of those, then one, you're not going to win any more elections. But then two, if there's not at least the appearances of a free and fair election, voters will just check out. That's been one of the major problems with getting a lot of voters to participate, is they believe that the election system's rigged, that there's no difference between the two parties. And we need to do a good job of reforming our election system, especially in those swing states that there were so many irregularities in. But the second biggest threat that we're facing, and Rachel and APP and CPI and Rachel have worked together quite intensely on this, is big tech reform. Our ability to communicate political messages directly to voters. It's such a special thing in America that everyday people get to vote, but it's also a special thing that they get to ingest and digest information and then be able to make a decision about that information. And what we saw this year with the elections is big tech conspired with the big corporations and the progressives at the independent fact checker network that was set up by Facebook to eliminate our ability to communicate to voters directly. They shut down several $100,000 worth of ads that were being run by my organization, American Principles Project, simply because they were on the issue of transgender sports, which is, we tied everything to the Equality Act. It was very fact-based. I gave the PolitiFact people and Facebook, I gave them 47 cases in the United States alone where boys were competing in girls' sports and had taken championships and scholarships away from them. And they still shut the ads down because they were, quote unquote, missing context. They forgot to mention and tell everyone that the ads are missing context because they're an argument, and arguments by their very definition miss context. And so look, it's a big threat, and it's there's a lot of talk about the ending of democracy and the war on democracy from Trump. This is really happening, and this is the actual war on democracy and people being able. And I had a call with a reporter from the New York Times yesterday. It's very interesting because they live in a totally different world than we do. But I brought up the point that these big tech companies, if they don't trust the people to be able to hear or see political advertisements and then make a decision on a good decision on whether or not those ads are true or false, then they really don't trust people to choose their politicians and make a good decision there either. So it's like this pessimism in really the American experiment and democracy itself. But thirdly, family formation is very, very important, obviously. But we're getting, with this Equality Act and the debate over that, we're getting ready to really destroy a lot of family formation and hurt the family in a lot of ways. One of the big things that we hear when we do our polling and our research with voters in America is people aren't having kids because they're worried about the future of this country. They're worried about the education they're going to get. They're worried about being able to provide for them. And this Equality Act really goes to the heart of that. And it's a concern that I have as a parent, because if the Equality Act's passed, what's going to happen is they're going to put all of this into our schools. They're going to confuse our kids about gender and this transgender stuff. They're going to teach our kids very odd, weird, unscientific things about sexuality. And we as parents won't be able to do anything besides pay thousands of dollars extra every year to send our kids to a private school or take on the heavy burden of homeschooling, which we're willing to do because they're our children and we love it, but we're worried about all these other parents who don't have those opportunities or the ability to do it. So I think that the three big threats facing this country are election integrity, big tech reform, and censorship of political messages. But then thirdly, the Equality Act. We can go on offense, and we'll be laying out plans to address the other concerns for family formation, because, and just real shortly, I know I've been talking for a while, but the family I view as the tip of the spear to fighting identity politics. The progressives view America and Americans as being divided into different groups. And the family really is the only group that matters. And if we can address Americans as families and as individuals, that's probably the best way we're going to be able to defeat identity politics. And so we'll be looking at policies that can encourage family formation and go from there.
Mm-hmm. And so any kind of movement on the Equality Act would have to be preceded by filibuster reform, because the idea of getting 10 Republicans to join the Equality Act is a non-starter. Or is it, right? We saw with ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, 64 senators. So that must have included at least 10 Republicans in 2013 who signed on. I mean, Rachel, you were there during those debates.
Yeah, well, I think that it should tell you something when after, the Supreme Court handed down their decision on the Bostock case, there were only 3 Republican senators that made any sort of public statements about it, came to the Senate floor and raised issues with how this is an existential threat to people of faith, to anyone who has sort of traditional values. And those were, I think it was Senator Mike Lee, Josh Hawley, and Jim Langford. That was it. And you had a number of other Republican senators give favorable comments about it, right? Obviously, they were transparently relieved they didn't have to deal with it, right? They were happy the Supreme Court dealt with it for them. But this has been our problem, I think, in the Republican Party. We just haven't prioritized a lot of sort of the family formation cultural issues. We've ignored them. And we've, instead dealt with sort of fiscal issues, which is fine, right? But I think a lot of the base of our party doesn't care so much about those issues as they do about these issues that affect their day-to-day way of life. And when they feel that their way of life is under assault, they expect their elected representatives to address those concerns and to reflect those concerns in our body politic, right? And when, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add something onto that, Rachel, because I think that behind all of this, the refusal to reform big tech, the refusal to fix our election system, and the refusal to fight the most toxic elements of the LGBT movement, it's all rooted in this cowardice, I would claim it, or describe it as, and the Republican Party elected officials to where they don't want to be called bad names. And we can't let being called a bad name by our political opponents be a checkmate. It's ridiculous. One of the things I was really disturbed by is James Langford last week This is so ridiculous. He apologized to his Black constituents for questioning the results of the election. I don't know how that's a racial issue. I don't know how that is anything but an election integrity issue. But we're going to this pandering, and obviously he did that because reporters and progressives were attacking him as being racist for questioning the results of the election. It's ridiculous, and we have to get over it. Until we do, we're going to continue to suffer not just with legislation and being able to stand up and pass good things that our country needs, but we're going to suffer with voters because they view that as a huge weakness, and they view it as a betrayal of them. They know that, if the left just calls you a homophobe for opposing the Equality Act, well, are you really going to stand up to them on any other issue? I mean, they're putting boys in our daughters' sports, as ridiculous as that is, and we're letting them get away with it simply because we don't want to be called a transphobe. I don't even know what a transphobe is, but it's. So anyway, I just wanted to reiterate that it's really a cowardice and a weakness in the Republican Party that we have to get over.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the solution probably starts in not absorbing the premises uncritically of the other side. It's in challenging and examining those premises and then articulating them, which is why on a webinar I did last week, one of the hopes I would imagine that a lot of conservatives have, or that the new jurists that were appointed by the Trump administration can demonstrate why they were appointed, for their ability to reason and provide the kind of principled ground for objecting to either policy provisions that are, legal decisions that are masquerading as policy provisions, or as some courts have to, answer what are, profoundly political questions. So you would hope that these jurists would be in a position to articulate either why they're able to address certain issues, or why not? And in doing so, maybe be able to provide some useful paths by which Republican politicians can adopt some of their arguments.
Can I just add on the end of that, though? While I do think judges are important, judges are not going to save us, right? At the end of the day, so many of these questions are questions of self-government and consensus government, and policy itself cannot be made at the judicial level. We frequently like to push it out, and Republicans say this too, right? We say, oh, we hate judicial activism, but we secretly love judicial activism because that's what we keep asking for. We keep asking for the courts to define our cultural questions, that we, in a representative form of self-government, are the ones that should do that for us. And this is why I think people are just sort of fed up with Congress, because we have a Democratic Congress to take up, and small d Democratic Congress to take up, these questions of significance, whether they be, related to abortion or immigration or gay marriage, or all of these issues. These are questions of our social order and how we live together. That is fundamentally a role for the Congress. And so to watch, these senators and these House members continue to just deflect on question after question, of course, people are sort of frustrated and fed up with their representatives because they're not doing the job that the Constitution envisioned for them.
Well, Rachel, I couldn't agree more, and I'm glad you brought up Bostock, because I think you're right that kind of legislative application is what led to some of the jurists thinking that, well, if the Congress is not going to act, then we're going to act for them.
Right.
So it's a fine major premise. Let's make sure, though, to address the two significant parts of the Biden agenda that have been laid out. First, it's the $1.9 trillion coronavirus stimulus package. As we've discussed, by the way, this is a staggering amount, and I think we've already spent $4 trillion on coronavirus-related relief in the past year, and so now this is an additional $1.9 trillion. And again, and just for context, the entire 2008 recovery package was less than $1 trillion. Now, if you add in TARP, that brings the number up a bit more, but TARP partially paid for itself. But again, this is a staggering amount of money, and in any other context, this would be a non-starter, and yet here we are. So we talked a little bit about how the budget reconciliation process can be used, but since we're dealing with $1.9 trillion, not everything in that package can necessarily be passed through budget reconciliation, right? We had a proposal for $15 national minimum wage, but on the other hand, we also have things like money for businesses and schools, and more Paycheck Protection Act funds. So this is a big umbrella. How much, Rachel, and Terry, how much can we actually see of this 1.9 trillion? What parts of it pass through budget reconciliation versus the rest of it, which is more like a Democratic wish list?
Well, I think this is going to be the first test of what the Senate Democrats are willing to do, because the reconciliation process begins with a budget. It requires the Democrats to pass a budget in the Senate. That starts the process. That opens up a lot of opportunities for Republicans to force a lot of uncomfortable votes on Democrats who will be up in cycle in 2 years. So that's good news for Republicans should again they choose to use it. But the reconciliation process, then says, there's a number of revenue measures that can be passed, via the reconciliation process, which only requires 51 votes. It's a non-debatable motion. You cannot filibuster it. So this is why every major party loves to use it, right? This is how Democrats passed a lot of Obamacare. Republicans passed a lot of their tax reform via reconciliation. But there's something called the Byrd Rule that constrains sort of the material that can be used in reconciliation. But obviously this can be changed, right? It's actually in statute, but as we've seen in the past, the Senate can overcome a lot of these, rules for themselves by invoking new precedent. And so whether or not Democrats are going to force open the door of reconciliation to put more into it. And so that's where you'd put your tax changes. That's where you'd put, some of your revenue measures. You'd put all of that into reconciliation. Any sort of domestic policy changes, traditionally haven't been included in reconciliation. They've been what we call birded out. But that's a question I think, Republicans need to be on the defensive now, because I suspect, if I were a Senate Democrat, I would leave the legislative filibuster alone for the first 8 months or a year, and I'd go after that reconciliation process with gusto. And so that I think is the first on the chopping block for how the Senate functions. So that's, I think, going to be in the near term the first area they address.
Mm-hmm. And Rachel, how much can they use the budget reconciliation process to either overhaul the tax code or just wholesale replace the Trump tax cuts?
It would be fairly easy for them to do that in a big part. That's how Republicans have dealt with taxing issues for a long time. They can simply undo it. Now, they're going to have to keep their party together on that question, and then the House will have to weigh in as well. But it will not be difficult for them to weigh in through reconciliation on the tax issue.
Okay. Terry, do you have anything to add on the coronavirus stimulus?
No, the interesting thing for me about the coronavirus stimulus is I looked at the pay tables for families and for individuals, and this sounds ridiculous to me, and I just don't know how they're going to pay for it. But I have 5 kids, and I would get around $10,000. I just find that to be so crazy. I could always use another $10,000.
Who couldn't?
I know, but I would feel really guilty taking that. But at the same time, what do I do? It's going to go out. They're going to pay for it, but I don't know how they're going to pay for it. My biggest regret, though, frankly, is that we didn't get the checks done in time. We didn't, I don't know why
You're saying before Georgia or before the general, Terry?
Yeah, before Georgia. I mean, I look at this and it's that was a really Pyrrhic victory. I guess you could call it a victory for Senate Republicans, is killing that $2,000 check that everyone was asking for, because it's gonna be even worse now. Now that would have been only 14, or I'm sorry, that would have been a total of 2,000. Now people are technically going to get $2,600 because they got the 600 and they're going to do another 2,000. So I think we got to get better with strategy. I think they should have just done the $2,000 checks, and we might actually be dealing with a different situation with the Georgia elections.
Mm-hmm. Well, aside from the $1.9 trillion stimulus, we also have immigration, and news reports suggest that a Biden plan, a preview of a Biden plan, would have an 8-year path to citizenship for anywhere between 11 million to 20 million. Undocumented immigrants, aliens. How does and for all the budget hawks concerns about the $1.9 trillion package, immigration is really going to be what kicks up a firestorm, largely because, as Rachel said, this is going to have to overcome the filibuster. But could immigration, Terry, Rachel, could immigration be the issue that does force action from Senate Democrats to abolish the filibuster, because it's such a core priority for them?
I'll go first and then let Rachel handle it afterwards, because I have just a little bit to add here. I don't know if it would force them to end the filibuster. There are still a good amount of Republicans who bill themselves as pro-amnesty. And I think they could probably find 10 Republicans, they could find 14 Republicans to endorse the ENDA. I think they could probably find more to endorse some type of amnesty bill.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps things have changed enough with President Trump as our president for the last 4 years. But I think that if they do go forward with something like that, I think that a pro-family agenda in an anti-progressive social issues campaign is going to be very important, because it's going to, I would love to run ads in Spanish going after all of those new citizens, telling them what Democrats want to teach their children, because on the values front, I imagine that they're really with us, several $1 million. That's going to be a pain in the butt, but we'd have to go after them on social issues, I think.
Rachel, on immigration, I can see Terry's point about a strategy if this does pass, but a lot of this can still be done with pen and phone. Not all of it, of course, but to have the kind of overhaul that I think Democrat activists want on immigration, I think they would have to get rid of the filibuster. But what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, it may be the thing that provokes it, but again, like I think Democrats are going to do reconciliation first, and then if they do go after the filibuster, it'll be something, some massive deal that they bait Republicans into, opposing repeatedly, and then say, oh, look, we have no choice, right? We have to nuke the filibuster. So maybe it's immigration, maybe it's sort of, this is a dynamic environment, so we don't know kind of what issue is going to come up, but this is going to be a key test for Republicans in terms of what they are going to look like as a party going forward, because we've always given lip service, I think, to border security, to all these issues. But at the end of the day, we've never fought very hard against this, sort of neoliberalism that says, well, any sort of cheap labor is good, any sort of open immigration is good. Are we still that party? Because this is now the time where we distinguish ourselves. And that doesn't, that means opposing an executive amnesty program. That means standing up for border security, but it means wholesale reform of our immigration system. Mm-hmm. That has been the problem consistently, is that we have presidents who basically make it up as they go because our laws are so outdated and not reflective of our current needs. And so this is going to be an area for the Republican Party to distinguish itself, I think, on a number of fronts. And again, I think from a policy, from a legislative opposition strategy, I thought it was really stupid of the Republicans, honestly, to agree to a year-long funding bill at the end of the Trump presidency, mm-hmm. because they removed every piece of leverage they would have had to address these issues in a funding bill going forward, because that's all we do, right? Because we don't actually pass forward-looking policy anymore. We just fight about money.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they removed the ability of us to have this debate in March, for instance, where we could have tied a lot of the Biden administration's hands by saying, we're going to not fund, X, Y, or Z. We're not going to, you're going to put in an executive amnesty. We're not going to fund it, or Republicans took away a lot of their own leverage in doing that. And so we won't have a chance to address any of those funding questions for another year. And so, Republicans better be able and willing to do it at that point, because they removed the ability of them to do it sooner.
I just want to add on to that. I think that the bigger point here is that it's not an accident that they removed the leverage.
Right.
They don't want the fight. And that's the scariest thing, I think, for Rachel and I, is that they don't want these fights. They do not want the risks. They do not want the exposure. And that's what politics is. Like, at the nature of politics, just like the romantic version of politics, right? If I was to just tell someone, it's robust policy debates, and mm-hmm. it involves drama and winning elections and losing elections. And we have an entire political party, at least one that's controlled by leaders who don't want the leverage. They don't want the fights. They are actively seeking to avoid these types of fights. And what you end up with is this slowed decline instead of any hope or chance for turning the ship around.
Yeah, say what you will about the underlying causes of the Kavanaugh confirmation blow up, but if that wasn't the kind of drama and the kind of debates about how important these votes that our members take, I don't know what would be. But before we shift to Q&A, I did want to ask a question, because we have been talking a bit about the Senate, but the House is also going to be driving policy as well. Nancy Pelosi does have the slimmest House majority since at some point in the 19th century. And with redistricting on the horizon, likely favoring Republicans, she certainly has a fear of losing that majority in 2022. Do you both see any of those concerns cabining in how much legislation she allows to reach the floor, so that vulnerable members have to take tough votes on things like immigration, and if, for example, the legislative filibuster in the Senate does go, court packing and the like?
Yeah, well, don't forget also she's losing some of her members to cabinet posts.
Yeah,
so
in the near term, that's right.
Right. So I think it's, she's got to juggle this. And I think what I'm most curious to watch is how she deals with her progressives. And that in part depends on how organized the progressives decide to be. Because we've seen how powerful a voting bloc can be in the House. We've seen this with the Freedom Caucus. If the progressives ever organize themselves in a similar fashion, Nancy Pelosi could be toast, right? Because she needs their votes. And, I don't know what kind of backdoor negotiations are going on in terms of, well, I won't do this if you give me that. But this is going to be a juggle, I think, or a tightrope walk for her. Because, she's going to have to give them some concessions. And, again, to the point Terry made earlier about Democrats overstepping, they very much may do it in the House. And that will set up, I think, some interesting races for 2022.
And I just want to add, I don't think Democrats are afraid of losing elections. I think they view policy and legislative wins as being necessary sometimes to risk losing your election. So I think that they're, in a very odd sense, they're in a way more Christ-like in that they're willing to die to themselves to get some good policy gains for their mission. I think they view this as a right moment, and I think they saw some shortcomings in the 2009-2010 Congress, and I think they're going to do everything they can to avoid those mistakes again. And they have a better media situation now, and so I don't think they're afraid of losing elections. I think that they're going to go full bore and all out.
No, I think Terry, I think your pessimism is well founded. Unfortunately. Well, let's shift to some of the questions in the queue. The first one comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, how do you see the dynamics play out within the Republican Party in the aftermath of the Capitol riot on January 6th? Those people who tried to oppose the election results, are they viewed as heroes within their own party, and will they be shaping the Republican agenda, or are they anti-heroes and nobody will be collaborating with them? For either of you.
So, the early outlook, is that McConnell apparently does want to sort of punish Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz. There's rumors he wants to strip them of their subcommittee chairmanship or, subcommittee positions, remove them their ability to influence outcomes, which I think would be a giant mistake. Whether you agree or not with the political wisdom of what they did, I think two things are true here. One, they are not in any way responsible for the violence that happened, which was reprehensible on January 6th. Senators using their procedural rights is never tantamount to violence. And if we concede that point, if we go down this road, this is a dark, dark path, I think, for our representative government, if that's the case. But the second issue is that I think that, what Hawley and Cruz were doing was representing their voters. I mean, election integrity was the biggest, and I think remains one of the biggest issues on the minds of voters. And those senators were trying to channel those concerns into our self-government, into our body politic, which is what they are supposed to do. This is what we elect people to do. And I think, had the Republican conference at all, leading up to this point, given these concerns credence, said, hey, we don't know what's going on, but it's very possible that there is something here, right? We're going to have hearings. We're going to try and leverage that big spending bill and force some kind of electoral reform at the state level. And, hey, if Republican voters, if you give us the Senate majority in January, we are going to make electoral reform and integrity the number one issue for our conference. If they had given at all some kind of credence or heed to these concerns, I think it would have been cathartic for the Republicans, right? They would have heard their concerns voiced and addressed, and you wouldn't have had to have this very high stakes fight at the end, in January. And so I actually lay a lot of the blame on the Republican leadership for not, being so disconnected from their own voting base that they didn't see this coming at all or try to address it. So, I think there's a lot of voters that still support Hawley and Cruz. They're going to take their knocks, keep their head down, but I think they're going to come out, frankly, a little bit stronger than when they went in.
And what I would say to that question is, I view what happened at the Capitol as, unrelated to what Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz did. What they were calling for was completely constitutional. It was a commission to look into the claims of voter fraud and how the election may have been stolen. I don't think that there was a serious effort to overturn the election results. There was, a lot of conspiracy theories out there that were being promoted by lots of different groups. But at the end of the day, I think that you can walk, talk, and chew bubblegum. And I think at the same time, you can walk, talk about election fraud and not, go storm the Capitol. So I look, there were 74 million people that voted for Donald Trump. 76% of Republicans feel that the election was stolen from them. And if we're going to have a united country and a nation where everyone feels like their voice matters, we have to address their concerns. I mean, it's half of the country feels that there was election fraud. And you don't just discount what they see or what they feel or how they feel just because you're in power and you're in control. The videos that were coming out, the evidence that we've seen with the signatures that were verified of mail-in ballots, it's egregious. And we should do everything in our power to assure every American voter, not just Republicans, but every American voter, Democrat, Independent, or Republican, that the elections really are free and fair. You don't just tell them to sit down and shut up. That's only going to make problems even bigger. And so I agree with Rachel. I think that Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz have an even bigger future in the Republican Party. And I think that Republican attempts in leadership to squash them or diminish their efforts and punish them are only going to lead to an even bigger backlash.
Our next question comes from Stephen Dewey. Stephen asks, Rachel, Terry, what are your preliminary outlooks on the 2022 Senate races? Do you know if this is a particularly good year for Democrats to be going after Republican seats, or is this a year where Democrats are defending many seats and Republicans can go on offense?
I'm very hopeful that we can go on offense, just with all of the overreach that we're expecting the Democrats to do. As it stands right now, there's 34 seats that are up. 20 of those are Republicans and only 14 of those are Democrats. But it's a great year. There's some tricky seats that we have, like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Florida are all up, and North Carolina's up as well. But if I had to choose a year to defend purple states like that, or more difficult states, it would be 2022 or 2010 type wave year. I do think that if the Democrats overreach enough, we'll have a chance at possibly some less likely seats that are held by Democrats, like Colorado or Arizona. And don't forget, we also have Georgia. Raphael Warnock, who just won the runoff against Kelly Loeffler, he has to defend his reelection this upcoming year. And so there's some good pickup opportunities. We're going to be on defense mostly because it's just 20 to 14. That's tough to pick up there, but it's a great year to go into that type of setup.
Mm-hmm. Rachel?
Yeah, this is why I think it's going to be really important for Republicans to be for something. And by that, I mean, not, they should be vocally opposing Democrats, but a press release saying I vocally oppose this issue is not going to be good enough anymore, right? We need sort of activity. Voters need to see their members engaging in the parliamentary battles. They need to see them on the floor of the House and the Senate, actually standing up for, what they think their party should represent. And the voters want to see that and they want to hear that because, again, we're dealing with a very demoralized base right now. That's just the reality. We have a lot of people that just want to throw up their hands and give up on the Republican Party. And, simply, raising concerns about the deficit is not going to cut it anymore, right? You can raise concerns, and you should, about the deficit, but you got to talk about other issues too. And we historically as a party have been very bad at that. And so I think this is going to be what voters are going to be looking for, from their members in the next couple of years.
I'm going to now bring our founder and director, Hadley Arcus, back in, since he is waiting in the wings. And let's see if he can start his video. Okay.
These are really rich presentations, a few things, I hope I can tie this together, but I was wondering, do we ever imagine we'd be living in a country in which a legislature could threaten to punish parents for seeking counsel for a child who is confused about his sex? Sex is the most objective definition of what constitutes us as persons. And I don't think this is a problem simply for the religious. As our friend David Crawford at Catholic U pointed out, this is the metaphysic of Boston, a different teaching on how we're constituted. Quite apart from whether you have a religious family, the youngster in the family may be quite confused now as to whether his sister really is his sister, his mother is mother, his father is father. And that kind of confusion just simply begets more confusion. A few days ago, it's about last week, the HHS, with dear friends of ours working on this, managed to alter these letters of guidance and alter some regulations to make it clear that discrimination on the basis of gender would not be one of those issues that could create problems for schools if they don't, if they still insist on trying to make a distinction between male and female or bathrooms and so on. But we're not going to get away with this even in, now that's all going to be changed, I think. We'll assume that a new administration will sweep away anything that has the works of Donald Trump attached to it. But there you point again to that problem of the executive, power of the executive. The executive can take the initiative, and it becomes very hard for the legislature to undo it. FDR seizes an aircraft company in June 1941, before we're in a war, and Congress has to come in to provide the statutory ground for doing that. The pressure's on Congress to do that. Obama comes out with DACA, and it becomes very hard for people in Congress to want to be in a position to take away something that's been given. So the executive will always have this added leverage in these things. Nancy Pelosi, I want to get your Rachel and Terry's sense of this. Rachel, Nancy Pelosi has put the accent on structure, looking at the structural advantages to change the electoral system. And when we're considering these things, the issue in packing the court, so many of the Democrats consider the appointment of those 3 men to the Supreme Court, 2 men and 1 woman, who've been illegitimate in a number of ways. And I think the passion to pack the court is one of those critical strategic things they're thinking about. And perhaps even this matter of statehood for DC and Puerto Rico. Those become a problem, of course, if the filibuster can be sustained. And I certainly agree with Rachel. I don't think Joe Manchin is quite the tower of strength that people need is here. But I just want to get your sense of 2 things. One, wouldn't these structural issues of power, the distribution of power, whether around changing the electoral system, packing the court, wouldn't they be consider these things far more decisive and important than, as Rachel says, arguing about spending again? I was just brought late news that Mitch McConnell has now blamed Trump for stirring the riot, even though it was going on even before he was speaking, I gather. Of course, it's no secret. His wife, was one of the first people to resign from the administration. So a couple of things I'd like to get from you. What your sense of whether or not those strategic interests will in fact override any other concerns about policy, whether it's medical care and so on. And second, what do you think that McConnell and the Republicans are going to acquiesce in a trial of Trump, even after he's out of office? I want to see what your guess is about that.
Well, I think your point about sort of the strategic elements of power being extremely important right now is well taken. And that's why I think it's so important to watch what Mitch McConnell does in this power sharing agreement, because that is going to be the first sign of how seriously he takes those threats. Because, I have been vocal about my criticism of Senate Republicans because I think their leadership in particular very much likes making deals with Democrats, right? They are very much concerned only with their own power and sort of this, I don't have another word for it besides neoliberal consensus on big finance, open borders, these kind of issues. And as long as that is not threatened, they will make deals on whatever they have to do. And so if Mitch McConnell is willing to deal with Chuck Schumer right out of the gate, after Chuck Schumer spent the last year talking about how he was going to destroy our functions of representative government, that should be a problem. That should be a problem for every Republican voter because it tells you where his priorities lie and it's not with the base. And I think this is also true of how he is treating Trump and how an impeachment trial would go, because I think a lot of institutional Republicans are putting a lot of blame on Donald Trump as a way of not dealing with their own failures in this process, right? Mitch McConnell chose our candidates in Georgia. He chose our candidates in Arizona. He was, and very much against the wishes of some of the governors. He is responsible for how those races went. He's, responsible for what the Republican Senate chose to address and what they did not. And so I think to just kick Trump, because it's convenient, doesn't deal with a lot of reckoning the Republican Party has to do. And I think it would be a mistake. And I think Republican voters will see through this and, may punish elected Republicans for it.
May I just draw Rachel out on one other point she mentioned? There was a concern about the mail-in ballot a long while off, and even Trump was raising questions earlier as to whether this is going to be a fair election. We saw this coming. It was already in the works. It was endemic imminent in this very arrangement of this ballot. Rachel, I was taken by your comments. For what do you think the Republicans could have done more strategically to have averted that situation? I gather you think that there were levers available in the Senate to deal with it.
Well, I think two things should have happened. And, all of them deal with the fact that they should have taken this seriously. We knew there was going to be problems in this election. It was an unprecedented mail-in ballot election. We've never dealt with this before. The fact that there were going to be problems should have been self-evident. And I think to a lot of people in Washington, they were, except that our institutions didn't take it seriously. The RNC, didn't send out teams, ahead of this election. There were no proactive measures taken to address this on the ground. But then, afterward, right, there should have been of at least a vocal taking of it seriously from elected Republicans. Because again, you never want to leave Republican senators in a position that Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley found themselves, which is a binary position of having to object to certification of electors or basically ignore the biggest concern of their voters. You should never put Republican politicians in that position. It's a failure of leadership that they found themselves there. There should have been hearings, there should have been commissions, there should have been any number of issues to take this seriously and provide the catharsis necessary for the base. And I honestly think we could have avoided a lot of the terrible, tragic violence that we saw on January 6th if Republicans had at least tried to at least rhetorically take it seriously.
Our friend Steve Presser at Northwestern just made the argument for the sake of dealing with this division, that we really should have some kind of a commission now to look with some disinterest and then closely into this. I think we do need it. I think the prospects of getting it would be quite slim.
Professor Arcus, there already was a commission on election integrity that was headed up by President Jimmy Carter and James Baker. And as you pointed out, this is the mail-in balloting has been a problem for a long time, and they actually mentioned this as a huge deal in their report on election integrity. And so we should bring those guys back and see if they still have the same opinions. It might have changed in light of new political pressures, but
after listening to you two, I think maybe I should be in touch with John O'Sullivan and look again into that apartment in Budapest. Anyway, I would see. We have some other click.
Thank you, Professor Arcus. Okay, so the back and forth has triggered a flurry of activity in the question and answer queue. And so I'm going to do my best to try and address as many of these, but we encourage you, if you're listening, to please continue to submit more questions. There were two interrelated questions that have been submitted, so I'm going to do my best to combine them. They build off of what we've been discussing about the effect of the strategy on the Georgia runoff and the $2,000 checks. So first question is from Gary Lehner, and Gary asks, why did President Trump not fight for this as a requirement of the negotiation, the $2,000 checks, instead of complaining about it after a deal had been reached? To him, it made no sense and put GOP leadership on the defensive. And another questioner, anonymous, asks if we had a demoralized base, not because of the $2,000 checks, but rather a base that didn't trust electoral results. How do you see these problems as interrelated, and then perhaps as the basis for how to understand what motivates some of those voters that, Terry, I think you were talking about, will not show up unless they have an actual reason to show up, be it candidate quality or some kind of definite policy platform?
Well, I think regarding the $2,000 checks and the negotiations, I know for a fact that the $2,000 checks were brought up in the negotiations. I think that probably here it was a matter of coordination and not wanting to have the president involved. And by the way, these things have gotten so complicated with all the different staff members that are involved. There's a lot of backstabbing, as we've seen every day in Politico with the new leaks that came out of the White House, all throughout the Trump presidency. So there's lots of different interests, and we don't really have a united party, let alone a united executive, unfortunately. But I sympathize with the thought or the sentiment that there was a demoralized and depressed turnout in Georgia because of Republicans' unwillingness to address the voter fraud issues. Unfortunately, until we actually change the system, the only way to address voter fraud is just to show up in even bigger numbers and do everything we can. When I ran my dad's campaign back in 2010 when we won, we were actually accounting for 3% of the election to be stolen. So we inflated our target goals by 5% as election targets because we wanted to overcome any types of voter fraud. This is something that Republicans have been doing, for decades now, and that was really the answer, I think, to Republicans. And so if I was, Brian Kemp or any of the senators that were running in Georgia, I would have told them, because here's the thing: the only way you can actually change policies is by winning elections. And so it doesn't make sense. Lynn Wood and other leaders were telling voters in Georgia, why would you vote in a corrupt election system? Well, it's our only option besides what we saw at the Capitol the other day. Elections help us avoid violence and unrest. And so the answer was not to not vote and be demoralized, but to show up and make sure that every single person that you ever have met in your entire life shows up to vote. So that's I do think that the failure to address voter fraud, or even give them any bit of credence or motivation and at least fake that you were going to address voter fraud as soon as you won the election. They just told people to sit down and shut up, and that they were conspiracy theorists for questioning what they saw. I mean, don't forget, we saw incriminating videos of people pulling ballots out from under tables that were in suitcases, videos of polling locations in Detroit and in Georgia where they were covering up the windows so that people couldn't see how they were counting the ballots and running the election. We saw things that made us think there was shady stuff going on. And the answer, not just from Democrats and from the progressives in the media, but from our own Republican Party, was, no, you're wrong, sit down, shut up. These are the certified election results. There was nothing wrong here. And that just was the worst possible answer.
Mm-hmm. Rachel?
So I would just add on the checks issue, right? People forget that the whole coronavirus, the last package of negotiations, stretched on for months. You had Trump's Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, wandering the halls of the Capitol over the summer looking for a dance partner. And McConnell refused to deal with him, and Pelosi refused to deal with him. So, I think to say that he parachuted in at the last minute, he did sort of with the checks, but this was an ongoing negotiation that the White House was begging Congress to do that Congress just refused. But I think, on the broader issue, part of the problem is that the Senate and the Senate in particular doesn't vote anymore. Like, it just doesn't vote. It doesn't take up any issue of substance. And I think the quickest way to dispatch the issue of the checks is just put it on the floor. Make the members vote on it. They can vote for it or against it, but then it's done. And it's a done question. But of course, we didn't see that. We saw McConnell package it with a number of other issues, so it was completely designed to fail and have
Section 230 among them.
Right, and have little meaning for any of those issues. And so, I just think it was a stupid hill to die on when you could have just put it on the floor, voted on it, and maybe it passed, maybe it didn't, but dispatch it as an issue. And so I think that was a strategic error.
Yeah, Rachel, what are your thoughts on the fate of 230? Coming back to a subject we discussed earlier, one of our anonymous questioners asks, is the only hope for 230's removal being a change in consensus among Republicans and then a trifecta for them?
So obviously, there needs to be something done about big tech. And I think a lot of voters are really frustrated that Republicans wasted 4 years chest thumping at hearings and doing very little else. And to be honest, part of it was that Republicans themselves have not coalesced around a strategy. There are still Republicans who think that what happened, to the president is acceptable. What happened to Parler is just the private market, and they don't see any problem with it. And I think now we need to coalesce around, we need to all agree at least that there is a problem. We can disagree about what to do with it, but we have to say there is a problem now. It's self-evident that there is. I do worry a little bit. I'm interested to hear Terry's take on this because his, APP has been very active on Section 230 as well. I am a little worried about the Section 230 debate because Democrats want to do Section 230 reform, but in a very different way than Republicans, right? They want to use it to censor more speech and to shut down their political opponents, where Republicans generally want more speech, and they want to leverage Section 230 to that end. And so I'm a little worried about the issue being sort of leveraged by Democrats in very irresponsible ways. I do think Republicans need to have an ecumenical approach to big tech. Section 230 is not going to solve the entire problem. I think there needs to be some robust antitrust enforcement and oversight that Republicans need to get on the same page about. I think interoperability, data portability, all of these things, I think changing our policies to reflect the digital economy and sort of the entrenched gatekeepers we now see to speech is going to require a multi-pronged approach. And this is the time for Republicans to actually get serious and get on the same page about what that looks like.
Yeah, just to reiterate, I do think that antitrust has to be a larger part of the conversation than just Section 230. But I mean, especially with what we saw with Parler, it's very clear that these tech giants have accumulated way too much power. They really are monopolies. When Amazon Web Services shut down Parler servers, I know that I might be getting technical here, but servers are not it's very difficult to quote build your own server, right? Like you have to have super fast internet. It costs a lot of money to have your own servers. So you either have to rely now on foreign servers, which aren't protected by US laws, or you companies that sell servers, especially just contracting out Amazon Web Services. So we do need to look more at antitrust. And Rachel's exactly right. The Democrats do want to do Section 230 reform, but they want to do it in the worst way possible, which is going to eliminate speech. And as Jack Dorsey is already signaling, they're going to go even further. I mean, Jack Dorsey just this past week was talking about how what they did with Trump was a difficult decision. But it's going to keep going, and it's much deeper than just President Trump, which means coming after people like Rachel and I, who just simply disagree with Twitter's policy benefits and loopholes that they have. So we do need to start talking about antitrust, especially in light of Parler, because they just have way too much power. And by the way, it's okay. This is what happens when nations grow and when industries grow, the internet is so brand new. Like, I compare the internet and the information revolution to the industrial revolution. You know, when the industrial revolution happened, we had all these factories that were like polluting the hell out of our air and our waterways. They were putting kids to work, and a lot of them were getting injured and dying. And we had to pass labor laws. We had to pass environmental laws to clean up our air and our water and keep our kids safe. And the same thing needs to happen with the internet and the information revolution, because think about it, like these guys have accumulated way too much power. They're polluting our kids' minds with porn. Like, you go to any porn site and pull up like the most violent, grotesque information without any age verification. This is crazy. And so this is something that's totally natural, and we need to go to it. And because if we don't, it's going to get much, much worse.
You know, we only have time for 2 more questions, but I think we have 2 in the queue that nicely kind of bring what we've discussed together, and ask us to look ahead a bit. So first is from our good friend, Doug Meyer, who asked me to read the question on his behalf. Doug asks, please comment further on the ultimate efficacy of winning elections. How can favorable election results, even when achieved, be anything other than a delaying action when, as Mr. Schilling said, all other significant institutions have been lost to the left? To what extent can electoral success change the culture?
I swear I did not ask Mr. Mayor or I didn't pay him to ask that question. Mm-hmm. So this is something very interesting, and it's core to APP's belief, which is that politics is not downstream from culture. When I say politics, I mean campaigns and elections and legislation. It's not downstream from culture. Politics is a part of culture, and the left has figured this out a long time ago. Politics is a driving force of culture. It can actually be used to change culture. We all know that the law is a teacher, and the law can change our society by, liberalizing laws or creating more restrictive laws. It changes the culture and changes the people and changes the institutions. And so what we need to start looking at is, what are ways in which we can change the laws or government programs in order to change our culture, right? So like one obvious area that we need to address is academia, because they're killing us. Like we're paying them, as parents, we're paying these schools hundreds of thousands of dollars to take our kids, turn them into drug addicts, turn them into sex fiends, and turn them into communists that hate us and start huge arguments when we go home. So what we need to start doing is, how do we reform academia and start pulling away their support and the benefits that they have to where they don't have that big of an impact on our children anymore. Big tech reform, that's a big aspect. When these companies are able and say views are out of the mainstream, when all you're saying is that boys are boys and girls are girls and they can't become each other, that has devastating effects, and we need to do what we can to reinforce that aspect of our laws. And so, just to go back, laws, policies, elections. I think time being, it gives now. We don't need more Garrett Snedekers or Hadley Arkuses, helping teach the right things, or we don't need, but we need to fight on those fronts. But politics is the one area of our culture where you and I can actually make a difference and have a change. Like we can't take over the university system in an election, and it's just a faster way to have change, and it's a more direct way to change the culture.
Thanks, Terry. Last question. This might be for both of you, but I'm going to ask it of Rachel. Do you see any issue that the GOP can bring up, either in the House or the Senate, that might be a wedge that would provide strategic advantage for Republicans that may cause a split between progressive Democrats and establishment Democrats, and force a reevaluation of the coalitions in a way that would benefit Republican either messaging or a core policy priority?
So I think two issues kind of lend themselves well to the fact that there is a definite realignment, I think, in the parties demographically. You know, one of them I think is immigration. And I'm not just talking about amnesty and border, you know, sort of border security, but I'm talking about real comprehensive immigration reform that looks at the ability of, you know, cheap labor, right? Importation of cheap labor, reform of the guest worker visa process. I'm talking about that kind of immigration reform. That focusing on, for the Republicans, focusing on that as an economic issue, as a way to lift the middle class, as a way to make sure that abuse of that area stops. And I'm specifically talking about, you know, the ability that giant corporations now have to sort of fire their mid-tier workers like in IT and import sort of foreign labor to do those jobs. That was never what was supposed to happen, but it is what is happening. So I think issues like that could be really useful because, again, Democrats are now the party of big business in many ways. And so I think you'd see some fracture there, I think. And I think other areas, you know, on some of these speech concerns and sort of corporate censorship of speech, you know, how we deal with big tech, I actually think is going to be a dividing, it could actually fracture Democrats and Republicans. And I think highlight sort of a new consensus that's building around how to deal with these issues. Those are two issues I think that, you know, both parties want to avoid for that reason. And so that's why I think forcing the debate on them is going to be really important.
Well, I think with that, we're going to leave it here. Terry, Rachel, thank you so much for being with us today. This was just such a rich, full discussion. It's going to be fun, obviously, a few years from now to look back and see how much we got wrong. But
probably a lot.
but that's because events, my dear boy, events intervene, not because of the great analysis that both of you shared. On behalf of everyone at the James Wilson Institute, to our attendees, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll have a recording of this webinar available within a few days for you to share. And until then, thank you so much again to our guests and attendees, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, guys.